I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. This is a podcast episode brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Our Vayikra series, Kedushas in the Details, explores the way the laws in the book of Vayikra try and elevate each of our most basic human functions: food intake, bodily functions, relationships, spaces of worship, and time. This year, we're taking a particularly honest and candid look at the way these laws do or do not yet function in our lives. This episode is sponsored by Esther Neiberg, marking the 23rd yahrzeit of her brother, David ben Yerachmiel V'Chava. To sponsor a podcast, email me at podcast@matan.org.il or contact the Matan office directly. Parshat Behar focuses entirely on the laws of Shemitta and Yovel, as well as laws pertaining to land and house sales and interest. Last year's episode on this Parsha, episode 107, was a conversation with Tamar Weissman about her family's experience keeping Shemitah as relatively new farmers. This year, we dive into the philosophical roots of the mitzvot of Shemitta and Yovel with Rabbi Binyamin Zimmerman, who is the head of the World Mizrachi's Musmachim Smicha program. He also serves as a senior educator at the Tomet Institute and is a katzin in the IDF rabbinate and director of Hezber, Hebrew English Source-Based Education Resources, and is the author, most important for our conversation today, of the Shemitta Sensation. In addition, the 9 volumes of From the Source with Spirit, a series of educational books for middle and high schoolers. Rabbi Binyamin Zimmerman, it is a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So before we get into the details of Parshat Behar, I kind of wanted to ask, and I always love biographies in general. That's something that highly interests me, as you know, from the pre-podcast conversation that we just had. I'm curious why write a book about Shemitah? I would even venture to say that it's a topic that many have been interested in the past. I would say like 3 Shemitah cycles. And I'm curious what pushed you, of all the halachic areas that I'm sure you sort of are deeply engaged in, why write about Shemitah?
Very good question. The truth is, when I came to Israel, there was, I knew very little to nothing about Shemitah. And when I was here for my first Shemitah year, all I learned about it when I was still a student, all I learned about it was what I couldn't eat and what was off limits, and disputes between different people and having to check out where you go for Shabbat, who's eating what, etc. It seemed to me something that a good amount of people were focusing on the restrictions without viewing Shemitah as something of a prescription. And because of a general feeling of Halakha in general, that Halakha is not a list of do's and don'ts, as much as a system that gives us the opportunity to have a deeper view of what the Torah really wants from us, what God's plan is for the universe and for the Jewish people. So I was convinced there had to be more about it. And the more I looked into it, I found a great deal of things in Hebrew, but absolutely nothing in English. I wouldn't say absolutely nothing, but very little in English. And some of the things that were coming out in English were focusing on some elements of Shemitah, but not on the broader picture. And therefore, I came with this idea, maybe that's a topic that would be worthy to write about. And the more I looked into it, the more I saw how important it was, and the more I connected to the mitzvah of Shemitah itself, and felt more of a responsibility at some point to try to share some of the things that I learned with others.
2 thoughts come up for me in response to that. The first is that I think I often say to students this idea of it's important to have your boundaries and know what you don't do, but if you only focus on things you don't do, it's going to be a very empty religious life, meaning it's really much more interesting. Again, it's also more than interesting, but it makes for a much more fruitful, meaningful avodat Hashem when you have also a concept of what you are filling your time with, what you are doing. I think that everyone can fall into that pattern. I think that there are particular age brackets that can fall into that more. That's one thought that comes up. I'm also just curious where the perspective of Halakha isn't a system of do's and don'ts, but it's a vision for how Hashem wants the world to look. I'm just curious where that was formulated for you. Meaning, is that something that someone taught you? Was it like an intuitive sense that came up for you and has colored your religious life? Or where'd that come from?
So I'll say, firstly, in response to your first thought, if okay.
Yeah.
So in response to your first thought, I think that it's not only that it makes religion deeper, it's also, connected to your second thought, but it's not only that it makes religious life a deeper experience if you have a greater understanding of, the broader picture and what these mitzvot are trying to do, but I think it's even, it's incorrect. Meaning it's not only to deepen experience, but to feel that the Torah is a list of do's and don'ts. I think the Torah tries to make it very clear that that's not what it's all about. That's, the first Rashi in the Torah, which is also connected to a broader look at the land of Israel and its role. But he asks the question, why doesn't the Torah start with HaChodesh Halakha? Why doesn't the Torah start with the first mitzvah to the Jews as a nation, which is a mitzvah about sanctifying the new month? And whatever the answer is, one thing is clear. The Torah did not just mean to write a code of this is what you do and this is what you don't do. Now, related to that, within your second question of how I see this as halakha in general, I'll ask you, even though it's not our topic, why do we refer to halakha as halakha? Meaning, when we refer to halakha, if you'd ask the average person, I won't ask you this, but I ask my own students this usually at the beginning of the year. What does the word halakha mean, and what is the quintessential book of halakha? So the common answer that you'll get is halakha is a list of how we act. And the quintessential book of halakha is a Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, or whatever book you use that's possibly more user-friendly and more contemporary, but with a goal of telling you how to act and how not to act. But if you look in the Torah, seemingly the definition of halakha is something much broader. The definition of halakha seemingly comes from Parshat Yitro, where Yitro tells Moshe Rabbeinu that your responsibility is to teach the people the laws and the statutes. You're supposed to guide people to the path in which you walk, halakha, and the act in which you do. When we refer to halakha, generally we refer to a small part of halakha, which is halakha l'ma'aseh, ha'ma'aseh asher yasun, the way in which you act. But halakha, the way it's described in the Torah, is much broader. That's an offshoot of how you act. But halakha itself is the general path. Everything in Torah, its whole perspective, is always described as paths. And therefore, I'm not going to elaborate too much on this idea, but if that's true, so then that's exactly what the Torah is telling us. Before you want to appreciate the ma'aser asher yasun, the acts that you do and that what you refrain from doing, first gain a general understanding of the derech, the path. And that also leaves room for us appreciating that even though we might find that different individuals in different communities have different acts, meaning people feel that this can be eaten, this cannot be eaten, etc. Generally, if you go a little bit further in the broader picture, the ma'aseh asher yasun, the acts, they dispute. But the derech asher yelchuva, the broader path of halakha, there's almost always, agreement on everything, if not almost everything. And therefore, seeing only a part of the picture, the do's and the don'ts, robs Judaism of its core.
I would add one more offshoot before we sort of get back to, or we start on our Shemitah exploration, which is that I often tell students when I teach halakha, halakha holechet, meaning not only is it a path that, I don't know if you would agree with this, and not only is it a path or sort of a broader philosophy with offshoot of practical actions, but even more in the world of practical actions, there's development of halakha. And so the halakha itself, we walk on its path, and the halakha also walks with us, right? So there's sort of like this dual relationship of development.
I would put it a little differently, if I may. And I would say that, what you just mentioned, the development of halakha. And does halakha change? Is a question that people often ask. So, bigadol, in general, my opinion is that halakha doesn't change. Halakha l'ma'aseh, of course, changes. Because the general goals and desires and picture of what the Torah wants from us, that's eternal. But how that applies itself in society, that is something that walks. That is something that walks with us. And that is something that changes due to experience and realities. And, how those eternal principles express themselves in our daily
Yeah,
existence.
no, I think that that's definitely what I intended to say. So I think we're in agreement on that point. Why don't we pivot to the Shemitah topic? And I'll just say as a broad introduction, important for our listeners to realize that the mitzvah of Shemitah is presented in multiple places. Its presentation in Behar is different from its presentation in Sefer Dvarim, and there's different elements that are included in one and not in the other. You can also check out past episodes for more detail on that as well. But I think in our conversation today, we'll both, because I really want us to hear your philosophy on the philosophical roots of Shemitah. So we'll also span more than just Parshat Behar, but we'll also get a little bit deeper into some of the particular elements of Parshat Behar itself. So why don't you jump into that wherever it feels right for you?
So I'll say, just you mentioned that Shemitah is mentioned a number of Parshot in the Torah. Chiefly amongst, it's generally assumed that that's Parshat Behar, but it's, to a certain degree, it's not really true at all. Shemitah doesn't appear in Parshat Behar even once.
Right.
Meaning it's known, Rashi's comment based upon the Midrash at the beginning of Parshat Behar, where all the laws of the sabbatical year are described and introduced with the fact that they were taught in Har Sinai, Behar Sinai. So, which is as opposed to the rest of Parshat Vayikra, which was taught in the Ohel Moed, in the tent of the meeting. The difference, though, is that Rashi asked the question, Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai? What does Shemitah have to do with Har Sinai? And there are many, many answers, many of them beautiful answers that are very, have a lot to teach and teach broader concepts. But the simple answer to the question is Shemitah is not really mentioned with Har Sinai at all. And the reason is because Parshat Behar describes the seventh year as Shabbat Haaretz. It describes it with the term Shabbat 7 times. And the whole essence of this is a different perspective than how Shemitah is mentioned elsewhere in the Torah. Even elsewhere in the Torah, it's not always described as Shemitah itself. But therefore, part of underscoring what the seventh year is all about, Parshat Behar wants to focus on the fact that this is a rest and sort of a departure from the general, the same way that Shabbat is a departure of the 6 days of work in order to reach the seventh and have a pinnacle to our week. This is a pinnacle of a 7-year cycle. And Yovel, as you mentioned before, is much like we're counting now during the Omer, 7 weeks of 7. There will be 7 years of 7 before we're ready for the 50th, before we're ready for the height of the experience.
So what you're describing, and obviously which is reflective of the truth, is that the Parsha, the details of Shemitah, whether the social aspects, the economic aspects, or even the national aspects when it comes to later elements later in the year, or perhaps the mitzvah of Hakel, which is also going to be intertwined, is that we have sort of this. Shemitah isn't just a mitzvah; it's something much broader than that. Like it's a concept. It might even be a theme that reaches far beyond the stipulations of a specific mitzvah. And I would say, even if I could just compare it to other topics we've spoken about in this season, I could say that there's bodily impurities, right? There's tumot haguf. But what we've tried to do very clearly is draw out themes in tumot haguf, meaning even if tzarat is not something that we sort of think about today or utilize that technical categorization, that there are themes, there are ideas latent in the idea that a body can contract impurity that we've been trying to draw out. So I wonder if we could start with sort of some broader themes that you take from the mitzvah of Shemitah, which again, I'm calling it a mitzvah, but it's really kind of like a phrase. It's a catch-all phrase for so many different elements of the actual observance of the sabbatical year.
I think you hit the nail on the head, meaning what we refer to as Shemitah is only one of the names because the Torah itself mentions the concepts of the seventh year in 7 different places in the Torah in a way that encapsulates many different areas of Jewish life. In the book itself, we tried to underscore 7 themes that are found throughout the Shemitah experience, where it's a time of Bein Adam Lamakom, of developing a deep relationship with God, where certainly at the most basic understanding, a person needs a sense of emunah bitachon, faith and trust in Hashem, in a year where you're not going to plant like you would every other year, especially in an agricultural society. There's ben adam lechaveiro, which is reflected in the fact that during this year, every single person can go into another's field, go and take from their fruit. Not only are they given permission, but it's essentially the fruit belongs to everyone. It doesn't even belong to the owner anymore. And it's a year to give usually the weakest sectors of society who are working on behalf of others freedom. They are not working this year. Not only are the bosses off on a different year, and there's Bein Adam La'atzmo. This is a year which is supposed to affect our character and transform who we are. And certainly, another aspect is Bein Adam La'artzo. This is a way to develop a deep connection to the land that we're on. And when the Torah describes the seventh year in different places, it uses different terms. The different terms, Shabbat Haaretz, is much more of a focus on the Bein Adam La'makom, Bein Adam La'artzo element. Shemitah is much more on the Bein Adam L'Chavero, Bein Adam La'atzmo element. And therefore, it's not a year of one element. The more you delve into the halakha behind the halakha l'maaseh, between the path that the Torah wants, you find that the simplest answer to ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai, what's the relationship between Shemitah and Har Sinai, is, as the Chatam Sofer says, Shemitah encapsulates all the values of the Har Sinai experience, all the values of what it means to be a Jew. And because of that, if we make Shemitah only a 1-year effort, we've missed the point. Because Shemitah is supposed to be within our conscious throughout the entire year, throughout the entire cycle of the 7-year cycle, the Shemitah year.
So first of all, I guess I want a small personal share. So my second daughter was born 10 days before the Shemitah year. And I mean, one day she'll probably not like us for this, but her name is Shomriya Shvi'it. I was playing around with it for a while. I knew I wanted to do something to do with Shemitah. I was like, Neta, I don't know. And then I decided to go for the alliteration. So you're giving me some nice ideas for Bat Mitzvah Joshua. We have another 3 years. There are really two elements that do come up in our Parsha, and also a little bit in the Parsha afterward, that I would love to go deeper on. In general, the economic side of Shemitah, which I would say, let's talk about the philosophical roots. I'm also very interested in how some people are trying to make this a more practical reality, meaning because since most of us are not farmers, and so the daily realities of the actual halachot of the seventh year don't apply on a daily basis to most of us, except as you said before, in a kind of sometimes a kind of nitty gritty way of like, what vegetables should I be eating or not. But we're not getting the full, I would say, moving picture of the process of how the growing is different and how the nurturing of the ground is different in this year. For many of us, the economic side of Shemitah actually has the possibility of coming much closer to our reality, because essentially all of us deal with our money, are dealing with our personal finances. And I'm curious, you can go at it from the philosophical psukim route or a practical route, but sort of to explore that a little bit more.
So when we mentioned that some of the people who have spoken about Shemitah have taken certain elements of Shemitah and highlighted them. Mm-hmm. And some who, in my personal opinion, have taken some elements of Shemitah out of context, have focused on, we'll call it the socialist elements of Shemitah. Meaning, in the seventh year, as we mentioned, one's fruit is hefker. The fruit growing on their own trees is, abandoned in the sense that anyone can go and take it. And when you think about it for this moment, it definitely sounds like a socialist reality. There is no private ownership mm-hmm. of an individual's property. And you take it to an extreme, and you think about it, there's an individual who spent time, money, effort in order to buy a tree, plant it, nourish it, and comes the seventh year, and all his own personal work is essentially on behalf of the community at large. He has no greater rights to the fruit of his own tree than others. I remember once hearing from a farmer in one of the kibbutzim where I did a tour of what they had, what they were doing for Shemitah, and he mentioned that his hobby is to grow exotic fruit. And because of that, he looks throughout the world. He's an agronomist, and he looks throughout the world of these fascinating types of fruits. He imports them to Israel. He brings them in. He plants them. He has to learn about each one and nourish them. And he has them in an area of exotic fruit on the kibbutz. And this is a kibbutz that observes Shemitah. And he said, comes in a group of 3 high school kids with sacks and start taking from these fruit. Not even, he said, when he takes each and every fruit, he looks at it, he almost kisses it. This is something that he grew in the land of Israel that is, a fascinating fruit that most people will never taste in their life. And here they're taking sacks full. And he said, the mitzvah of Shemitah is to hold myself back and to say, he said, I'm sitting there watching them and they could care less. As far as they're concerned, it's theirs just as much as it is mine. And then he said, but when they overdid it and they took too much, he said, even with Shemitah, you're only allowed to take, it's a question of what the exact amount is, but let's say the amount of 3 meals. You're only allowed to take a few meals worth and not more than that. He said, you guys, are taking enough fruit for a year. That's even according to Shemitah, that's not proper. But when you think about it from that perspective, definitely you could get the idea that maybe the Torah is really pointing us in the direction of socialism. You might even get the idea from Yovel, where land returns after, in the 50th year, land that was purchased from somebody else is essentially not purchased. It's only, rented from the individual for as many years until the Yovel cycle in order for it to be returned. And therefore, there are many who try to express the ideas of Shemitah by zoning in on those things. I think if you look at it a little bit deeper and try to describe this, partially because the Shemitah year is not just 1 year, it's 1 year of a 7-year cycle. It's a very fundamental year, but it impacts our outlook on the whole cycle, is the Torah did not advance an outlook of pro-capitalism or pro-socialism. It has a much more nuanced understanding of what it really wants our economy to be. It's meaning the Torah's value system is a value system, an economic system based upon the values of chesed, mishpat, tzedakah. That's what we already know to be true from the time of Avram Avinu, and that's what it wants. And mishpat tells us, Yigia kapecha kitocha, ashrecha b'tov lach, that a person who works and achieves, they have the right, and it tastes better if a person eats that which really belongs to them, that which they worked hard for. Mm-hmm. We do not like what the Kabbalists call nahamat kisufa, the bread of embarrassment. We value what the Gemara quotes from the Pasuk, sonei matanot yichya. Person should not want freebies. You just don't want. Should work in order to do, especially in the land of Israel, where all our working in the field is a fulfillment of Yishuv Haaretz, of settling the land and beautifying the land. And that belongs to us. But because we recognize that our success is not because of us, it's not it's not our strength and our value and our prowess that brings about it. But on the other hand, as the Ran points out in his drashot, ki hu hanoten lecha koach lasot chayil. Says the Ran, when we say that one should not look at their success in the land of Israel, especially as their own personal success due to their own greatness, but on the other hand, they shouldn't be oblivious to the fact that if they didn't work for it, it wouldn't happen. The proper perspective, says the Ran, is to thank God for giving us the success in the actions that we do. And therefore, part of the Shemitah year is to have a little bit of a realignment of our value system that is really true throughout the entire 7-year cycle, not only during the Shemitah year. The Shemitah year has some extremes, but at the same time, the Torah, if anything, if you would have to put it into these two terms of does the Torah advance something more akin to capitalism or socialism, I would actually say it's far more capitalism, but it's capitalism with a heart. And that heart is an understanding of we don't have ownership, certainly not full ownership of everything we achieve, because we never achieve everything. And therefore, since God is a silent partner in ensuring that everything is successful, part of our success is not something we give to the poor. Most of tzedakah has nothing to do with giving. Most of stuck has to do with which part we don't try to take for ourselves and leave for those who it really belongs to, which is the poor. And that's the system throughout the other 6 years of Matanot Aniyim.
Right. So I think if I understand you correctly, you're describing the fact that the Shemitah year, on one hand, also comes to try and balance out some natural human inclinations that can sort of take over our way of thinking about our success over the other 6 years, but also that Shemitah is a 1 year practical application of values that we're supposed to constantly be thinking about even throughout all the other 6 years. So, and there's 1 year where we sort of take it to a full extent, but obviously throughout all the years we should be thinking about the poor, and of course there are many other agricultural mitzvot that are also in place.
Definitely, but I'll rephrase it also as well, and that is because Shemitah is a year different than the other years, it requires us to really think what the other years is trying to accomplish as well. Meaning we're now in the Omer period, so we're getting ready for Shavuot. Shavuot, we read Megillat Ruth. Megillat Ruth is, among other things, a rags to riches story of a woman who joined the Jewish people, who would seemingly be the last one to think that she would be ultimately the grandmother of King David and ultimately Mashiach. But it all happened through mitzvot atliut ba'aretz. It all happens through her being able to go into a field of Boaz, a leader of the Jewish people at the time, to be able to go performing chesed, performing kindness on behalf of her mother-in-law, but to take from parts of the field as if it were hers herself, not as a beggar, and to ultimately be able to develop a relationship that turns out to be a fundamental relationship for the Jewish people as a whole. And therefore these value systems, and you see it where the Torah presents it, and you see it also within the values that the Torah wants to have throughout the period. I'll just mention as an extreme, one of the questions that certainly Yovel requires us to ask, which is mentioned in the Torah regarding Yovel, is Manocha b'shana shvi. What are we going to eat? We're not going to be planting. We're not going to be working the land in the way we usually do. What are we going to eat? So there are many questions with why this particular question was mentioned specifically regarding Yovel. Is it applicable during the 7th year as well? Obviously, Yovel could be 2 years in a row of not planting. The 7th year, the Shemitah year, which is then the 49th year, and then the 50th year, where Yovel has, among other things, the Halakha of Shemitah of not working the land. But with Yosef Yozel Horowitz, who was the Alter of Nevardok, who was very known for his extremism on the one hand, extreme focus on bitachon. He says a fascinating idea. He says the real question doesn't make sense that the Jewish people would be asking in the 7th year, what are we going to eat in the 7th year? 7th year, firstly, is the year that you still have the produce of the 6th year. The real fear is the 8th year. And he says on top of that, because there's a blessing during the 7th year from God, so people won't be asking the question. They have food to eat. When do people ask the question? So he says, a fasting understand, they ask the question in the 1st year of the Shemitah cycle. In the 1st year of the Shemitah cycle, a person already starts worrying, what's going to happen 7 years from now? I have to start hoarding my food already now. And he speaks about what the Torah wants you to understand is when you ask that question then, because the Shemitah year for the farmer is such an extreme, I have to be ready for 7 years from now. Much like Yosef tells Paro, you got to be ready. There'll be 7 years of plenty, but afterwards there won't. If you don't see God's hand in it throughout the 7-year experience, then you won't be able to get the blessing of bitachon, of trusting in God throughout the years, certainly as you see the blessing come to life.
Wow. Yeah, I will say that on a non-farmer level, meaning as someone who's not a farmer, that's an idea that my husband and I we speak about often. Whenever there's like a question or job switching or proportion switching, or we're not sure what's actually going to be coming in, and believe me, we both put in our hishtadlut on both of our sides. But my husband always says that it's ultimately, this is not totally up to us. And I feel like it's one of those spaces where, again, if you're staring at your crops and you know how everything grows, it's much harder to say that in the face of those crops. Something about money, which is a little bit less visible to our eyes. So maybe it lends itself sometimes in a maybe easier way to statements of emunah. But I think that it's a really, really powerful experience as a believing person to, after knowing you've done all you can, to pick up your hands and say, right, this is where my control ends. I think that it obviously relates to everything we do, whether it's raising our children or all of the big, great things we do in life, right? Where we put all of our effort in, and then we have to acknowledge that, there's a very clear line at which our efforts no longer are the thing that defines the outcome. And of course, Shemitah is sort of the ultimate expression of that when it comes to both food and also parnasa in a broader sense. But it's such an important lesson, because that the chase after the full control can drive people insane, honestly. Not only is it sort of like, can it be an internal hubris, but it can really make people lose sense of life. They could go crazy trying to get that sense of control. And I think that idea that you shared is also saying, you have 6 years to practice, meaning it's not just I'm worried about right now, what am I going to eat next year? But that idea that, no, that's what people are going to already be concerned about in the first year is what's going to be in 6 years. Well, you have 6 years to sort of figure out how to realign your heart space with the idea that the Torah is trying to teach you.
I think for sure, and I think also when you think about it, let's say Shemitah works. Okay, we're obviously going to assume that it does.
Right.
But let's say it does work. You get a year where you could focus on other elements and not only your job and not only your business. Meaning it's a bitachon of not seeing God's hand in your success throughout your endeavors, but a year where you can have other endeavors, a year where you can focus on spiritual growth, which is another one of the explanations of Ma'in and Shemitah Eitzel Har Sinai. Shemitah is a year where if you're not farming and you're not working and you're not worrying about how am I going to put food on the table, so then you could really, dedicate that year to possibly how everything was supposed to be in Gan Eden itself. And that is where the same term la'ochla is used in these contexts of eating, where eating is essentially a recognition of God provided me this food, much like the man, which is the same idea. The man, the term la'ochla is used. The Torah compares all these things together from the fact of recognizing that both when we do work and even when we take our breaks, our break is a necessary part of not being driven only by even our desire to, finance our way of life and our families, but at the same time also to recognize the value system in what we do in our yegia kapecha, in that which we work with our hands and with our minds, but at the same time to also recognize that that's not the only important thing in life. And there are spiritual values which in the difficulties that we have in the daily grind, we don't always get to in the way we would like to be able to take breaks and to be able to succeed. One of the things when I speak about Shemitah, I speak about some of the people who achieved great success, nothing to do with Shemitah, though that as well, who achieved great success by taking a year off of work. The sabbatical experience is something that for many people, even when it requires them to leave their jobs and to do what on paper makes no sense, but a year to be able to focus, a year to be able to think, a year to be able to dedicate yourself to what you really feel is important that you don't have time for, the power behind that, especially when it comes with a blessing from God, is something that is, very valuable.
I just want to add in 2 more images. We're sort of, I would say, a very big difficulty that's being faced by a lot of sort of like Gen Z age bracket is that, no, I'm going to say that differently. I have 2 images that come up for me when in response to that. One is the image of maternity leave. I'm going to bring in sort of a female side to this, that there is also something in this process where there's been 6 years of sort of creation and, birth or harvest really. And then we have this year where we're essentially, well, if something naturally is created, we're going to benefit from it, but we're not intentionally engaging in growing those. And I think any of the women listening to this know that there is, I mean, something overwhelming and tiring, but there's always something that's born within the woman who's given birth in that period of maternity leave. It's very common. Women decide to leave their jobs, or they decide to, or they, I know for me, I've come to a whole bunch of different spaces in this past year. I'm still almost at the 1 year mark of our last child and of my son. And there's always sort of an internal space that's sharpened, or understandings that are deepened. And as you said, part of it is also taking off time from your regular schedule there's something very fruitful about it, especially for the person who's been putting in that effort, quote unquote. Not only for the child, obviously, who has to develop and grow, but for the creator. But the other side of that is what we're seeing a lot, and I'm sure many people who are listening can think of their own children who are in this moment of life, where you have sort of a Gen Z kind of phenomenon of people who are spending a lot of time thinking and connecting to themselves, and they're having a hard time settling and choosing something that will create that 6-year routine. And I think that the Torah, it reminds us that it's really important to have time off, to be fruitful, to be able to take that time and introspect, but it has to be part of a system where there's a system of work and of routine. And if you don't have that anchor of those years of work, then that, it's good to have 1 year off, right? Meaning not that you're a constant sort of throwing all the cards up in the air, constantly reassessing. That makes people lose track of where they're trying to go, or make them not sure that they even know where they're going. So I think that like this reminder of like the 6 and 1, there's a really important reminder that's both resonant for people, and I think it's really necessary also for a particular generation who we just keep hearing so often. It's been very hard to sort of establish that routine of the 6.
I very much agree, and I'll add to that. Part of what I think the whole system is, and this is why, to me, I think it's it doesn't make sense to focus on one element of Shemitah outside of the broader picture, is because the nuance behind the Torah system basically takes certain ideas that are presented in an extreme in some times, and not only embraced, that extreme is embraced as that is going to be the panacea, that is going to make everything, that's going to fix the entire world. And what the Shemitah system tells us is, to a certain degree, not one thing is going to fix the entire world. There are a number of themes, a number of elements. There are a number of things that you have to understand. It can't all be done in 1 year. It has to be done through a cycle. And even that cycle has to have not only a realignment every 50 years, but it has to have almost a reset every 50 years. And within that cycle, when you start to understand, then you can give each value its system. And like you said, you have to have some, constant development before you're ready to take this time off, to be able to rethink about it and make sure that you're in the right direction.
Yeah, totally. Pause with us for a moment. I think I want to know which one you want to focus on as sort of like a final section. Do you have something else you would want to say specifically about Yovel, meaning why need another year when we just had a year of Shemitah? Or would you want to perhaps focus more on like a loan or debt, or you feel like you covered what you would want to say there?
I think loans is worthwhile, because Yovel is a little far from people.
Okay, great. So let's,
if you want to bring it to,
I'll give you a lead in.
loans.
Perfect. Okay, so as we sort of start to wind down the conversation, I guess I wanted to touch upon what, as I said earlier, I think is really most practical for people, which is the way that the philosophy and the laws of Shemitah relate to loans and to loans, and on the other side of things, debts. I think some of us are familiar with the idea that we have the concept, the construct of the Prusbul, which essentially sort of already annulled to a certain degree the way these laws functioned in our lives, because Hillel noticed that people were having a very difficult time actually lending money, and it seemed to not be pushing forward what the Torah was trying to do in the first place. So I'm curious your thoughts on the topic of loans, and also, do you see this sort of coming into our lives in a way that's practical and meaningful in the future?
It's a very good question. When we mentioned at the beginning that the Torah uses different terms for the 7th year, So one of those different terms is the word Shemitah. The simple understanding is that Shemitah is really associated only with that element of the seventh year, and that is the Shemitah, the releasing of loans at the end of the seventh year. It's not something that happens throughout the year. There is an opinion that there's something that happens at the beginning of the seventh year as well, but the generally accepted opinion is at the end of the seventh year, that moment where the agricultural laws of the Shemitah regarding the land itself cease, it's in that moment that the release of loans happens. Now, the release of loans sounds absurd. What does it mean? The release of loans. The general understanding of it is is that you borrowed money, you don't owe it anymore, right? That's what it's all about. So I think again, when a person looks into the laws of the seventh year, you start to understand that certain concepts that maybe even we take for granted and we define in a certain way, the more we look in the Torah, the more we see that seemingly the Torah had a different understanding. For instance, when we speak about tzedakah, at least I could tell you personally, when I was a kid and I heard the term tzedakah, tzedakah meant charity in the sense of you go and you give a gift to somebody else. If you look in the Torah itself, it doesn't seem to present tzedakah in that way at all. Tzedakah is always presented in the form of a loan. A loan, as the Rambam says, is the eighth and highest level of what we call tzedakah, what we call charity, because you're not giving a person the feeling of, I got something for nothing. At the end of the day, the goal is that the person is be able not only to be helped financially, but to be given a sense of, a sense of honor that we view them as an individual. That if we almost invest in them, meaning we give them without financially investing in them, but investing in their future of saying, "Here you have this, and pay it back to me when you're ready," is that they will actually succeed in being able to pay back that money. And therefore, the Torah's approach of the ultimate tzedakah is actually in a free loan society, free loan in the sense that we don't take interest. We give it to somebody else. On the other hand, what happens in the seventh year? So many people understand, okay, what's Shmitat Ksafim? It's not the release of loans, it's the cancellation of loans. That's how it's translated, cancellation of debts. But that's not true at all. The Torah does not want us to cancel debts. You get money from somebody else who already gave you this money interest-free. You have an absolute obligation to pay them back at all points. So what then is the release of loans? The release of loans is that they no longer can go to the courts and demand your return of the loan. It's now in your court. And there's, in my opinion, if you take these two ideas together, so you see a very different perspective on what the Torah really is guiding us towards to be able to help other people. And, this is a larger topic in its own right, but when we talk about free loans, the Torah's value, I'm not saying the practical halakha. Practical halakha, the Torah never allows us to collect interest. But the Torah distinguishes, when it talks about giving loans that are interest-free, it's focused on giving to poor people loans that are interest-free. Meaning we should be able to develop a system where poor people, when I say poor, people who don't have the money and they're not using the money to be able to invest, themselves, because it doesn't make sense that I give them interest-free loan for them to invest and financially benefit while I don't financially benefit. But the Torah is so clear that when we look at our money, we have to look at it as a means of helping other people. If it's money that I don't need at this moment, and I could help somebody else who needs the money for food, clothing, shelter, something like that, that's where the mitzvah is, the ultimate level of tzedakah, to believe in them, to believe that they'll be able to return the money and they'll be able to get their value system. And at the same time, you create a system where if you're falling under hard times, you'll be able to do so as well. And therefore, when we look at the system of loans and the way it's practiced in our day and age, where many people loan for many different reasons money, and there's always what's called a heter iska. Heter iska is the legal means, a legal halachic means of being able to loan money and accept interest. And at first glance, it seems like a gross, a gross undermining of what the Torah really wants. But it really depends when the heter iska is used. When a heter iska is used for poor people, then for sure. That's against the Torah's whole approach. I'm not saying it's not a necessary evil at some points, because we want to make sure that people can loan money, can have money to borrow. But on the other hand, when it's practiced in the financial realm, if done properly, I don't think it's against the spirit of the Torah's law. The Torah actually views that as an investment. That's what a heter iska is. It's really, I'm investing with the other individual who doesn't need this money to put food on the table. They need this money to be able to make money, and then I join him as a partner in the endeavor, not as someone just taking interest from them. And therefore, the Torah's approach is really to be able to differentiate who needs money, why they need money. And at the end of the Shemitah year, to be able to recognize that that individual I gave money, who didn't have money to put on the table, I believed in that, and I might even need the money back. But the mitzvah of Shemitah comes and tells me, you want to know what? It's now their decision if they're going to pay back. If they have the money, and this is seemingly explicit in the Mishnayot at the end of Masechet Shvi'it, and the way they're quoted in the Gemara and Gittin, especially with Rashi's explanation, once they have the money, I might even be able to use means to force them to pay me back, because they really do owe the money, but I can't forcibly collect it. If they need that restart, they need to know I'm debt-free in order to be able to start again. So then the hope is they could start again being debt-free. They will succeed, and then on their own volition, they will go and pay back the money.
Okay, that's something totally new to me that I never was aware of that. That's so.
You got to read the book.
I know I have to. I only had a few days, so I read a whole bunch, but I will get there. I really appreciate that. You know, it's funny. It was making me think of my husband, who, I mean, he and I just, you know, as naturally, we both have like totally different professional goals. And one of his has always been that he wanted to be comfortable enough to be somebody who could give tzedakah in a way that was free and plentiful, meaning it's still a goal that he's working towards. And as you described it, I'm thinking that, you know, instead of looking at his goal as something that's, you know, to be a gvir, essentially you're saying that's essentially what the Torah is saying, meaning to be able, you should look at your money as a means to be helping other people, which I don't know, I was really moved by that. I'll let him know.
I will also tell you, I don't know how much of this is fully public, but you can find on the internet, but there is a group specifically led by one rabbi, whose goal is to create a halachic bank. Halachic bank in the sense of, as far as I understand, I don't fully understand it yet, but we'll make these distinctions of free loans for those who need it because they're poor. Poor is the wrong word. They need it for their basic needs of life, and investments, and to be able to do it in a way where, number one, the people who become part of it actually, you know, they already have people becoming members of the bank, where you, to a certain degree, pay a membership fee, which gives you rights to certain loans when it's halachically necessary, a free loan. And at the same time, the other real investments, where it's you joining in, could actually be where the bank makes its money, and by that token, not have to resort to making money off of individuals who really the Torah very much wants us to be able to provide for them without looking for anything in return.
Wow, I'm going to check that out. I feel like a few years ago in a conversation also with Michael Eisenberg, we had actually had a conversation where he was trying to get, in the previous Shemitah, where he was trying to get involved in something that sounded somewhat similar. I'm going to check that out. But I really want to thank you, Rabbi Binyamin Zimmerman, for being here today and for exploring with us sort of the deeper roots of the seventh year, sabbatical year. Now I don't want to use the word Shemitah, of the root of what we're, you know, we have a few more years, obviously, to be thinking about it before we'll be back in another Shemitah cycle. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, and we should hear only good news.
Amen. Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.